In invertebrates, you don't have cardiac muscle cells, but you do have the other kinds. You've got smooth and striated muscles. And you also have some intermediate forms that are kind of a mix of smooth and striated muscle. So you do have some odd combinations that you would not find in vertebrates. With bivalves, there is selection pressure on the function of the adductor muscles that close the two shells. If those adductor muscles are made out of striated muscle, then the two shells can really snap together quickly because remember, striated muscle is really fast contracting. If you look at the top picture here, it may not be obvious, but this is a scallop and it's not sitting on the bottom, it's actually swimming because they can snap those shells together fast enough that they can get away from predators, things like starfish. Starfish are pretty slow to start with, but they can actually just snap those shells together and swim away. The picture below is a giant clam, and they have a different kind of muscle tissue forming those adductor muscles. It's smooth muscle, but it's actually a modified sort of smooth muscle. So they can close. Now they can't snap shut quickly because smooth muscle is slower at contracting, but the two shells can close, and once they close, they can maintain that muscle contraction for hours or days, and they can do it using very little metabolic energy because there is a special kind of protein in the thick filaments, it's called paramyosin, that's able to basically lock in the contracted configuration. So you don't need a bunch of nerve impulses basically saying stay contracted, stay contracted. It just contracts, it's not burning ATP, or maybe a little bit, but not very much, hardly anything. So it can really maintain that contraction for a long time. Insects that fly have to have flight muscles that can produce quite a bit of energy. And small insects that fly, like midges, are really tiny, and they have an incredibly fast wing beat frequency when they're flying. It's up to about 1,000 beats a second. Now the thing that's interesting about that is that neurons can't fire 1,000 times a second. You can't get a nerve impulse 1,000 times a second happening down a neuron, and but these animals are still beating their wings that fast. And you might think that an animal like a hummingbird is beating its wings fast. Hummingbirds beat their wings less than 100 beats per second. So we're talking about animals here that are at least have a wing beat frequency at least 10 times faster. So it's not a little bit faster. So these muscles that power the wings actually don't change length that much when they contract and relax. They're not actually changing length very much, but because of the way the leverage works to power the wings, they don't have to contract very much to make the wings move quite a bit. If you look at the picture, this is a cross section through the thorax of a midge, and you can see the wings coming off on the left and the right, and then you see the muscles that are inside the thorax. Now the roof of the thorax is attached to the tip of the wing. The bottom part of the thorax basically forms kind of a pivot point. So when these big muscles here that run up and down inside the thorax, when they contract, it basically pulls the top of the thorax down. And because of the way this lever works, that makes the wings go up a lot. If the top of the thorax just comes down a tiny bit, the wings go up a huge amount. So that's raising the wings. Now to make the wings go down, there are longitudinal muscles that run the length of the thorax. Here they are in the middle. And when they contract, they shorten the thorax a little bit, but also make it taller. So when they contract, that actually forces the roof of the thorax up a little bit. And as that goes up, again, because of this pivot point right here, that forces the wings down. So that's the mechanics of it. But again, nerves can't send signals fast enough for these midges to beat their wings 1,000 beats a second. The way that this works is that the stretching of the muscles actually triggers the next contraction. So if we go up to this top figure again, so imagine these muscles contract, And as they contract, they're pulling the roof of um, the roof of the thorax down, and they're stretching these longitudinal muscles a little bit. That stretching makes those muscles contract an instant later. And when they contract, they shorten the thorax and make the roof rise a little bit here, which stretches these muscles, which triggers them to contract a fraction of a second later. And so the way that this works in terms of the nervous system is that a nerve impulse goes out to start the wings beating, but because the contraction of one set of muscles triggers the contraction of the next set of muscles, and then that contraction makes the first set of muscles contract again. Once the wings are beating, they will keep beating for about 20 or 30 beats without a nerve impulse. So basically the nerve impulses come in every 20 to 30 beats, and the nerve impulses are basically just signaling keep the wings beating. That's all that they're doing. They're not, you don't get a nerve impulse for every wing beat. Now, I mentioned in terms of the way that the the muscles are attached to the skeleton, they tend to be attached in opposing orientation. So you'll have muscles that pull a joint one way and other muscles that'll pull the same joint in the opposite direction. And it's easy to imagine here with this picture of a person. So here's an endoskeleton, right? We've got this solid bone in the middle, and muscle is wrapped around it on the outside. And if you look at the bottom, it's just a schematic of it. So we've got the solid rod of bone here, and when this muscle contracts, the red one, that closes the elbow joint, right? That closes it, makes it move this way. When the opposing muscle contracts, which are the triceps on the other side, when this muscle contracts, because of the way this hinge is arranged, that opens the elbow joint. So the muscles are arranged in opposing groups. Now, this diagram came from a book that we used to use for the majors class. It came from Campbell, which is a really good book. If you get a chance to get an old edition, it's worth it to have it just as a reference. The newest edition is a fortune, but if you just get one or two editions back, you're paying pennies on the dollar. So it's worth it to have it just as a reference. But they really screwed up in this diagram. If you look at the way an arthropod skeleton works, it's very different from the way that an endoskeleton works, because an arthropod has an exoskeleton. So you basically have these bones that are solid rods on the inside of your body, and the muscles are around them to make the joints move. An exoskeleton is basically a hard tube with the muscles running inside of it to make the joints move. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom underneath the grasshopper, so imagine the green muscle in here contracts. Well, obviously that's going to open up the knee joint. This is supposed to be the knee of the grasshopper. And then if the red muscle contracts, which they're calling a flexor, I mean, if you look at the way it's attached, obviously it's going to open the same way. Both of those muscles are doing the same thing because the diagram wasn't done correctly. If you look at the little insert diagram at the bottom, that is the knee of a grasshopper, and you see with those muscles that they're going to have opposite actions from each other. One of them is the upper one is going to close the knee joint, and the lower one, the extensor muscle, is going to make that joint open when that one contracts. Your muscles, and especially your tendons, are elastic, so they can stretch like a rubber band, and then that energy is stored in there and it can be used later. Now, you use that a little bit when you're walking. So as you walk, the energy from one step as your foot hits the ground goes into stretching tendons and muscles to a lesser extent, and then that energy is used to help you take the next step. So you're not wasting all the energy from the first step. You're at least some of it gets moved to the next step and the next step. Kangaroos have been selected to have a really efficient system of storing that elastic energy as they move. So as a kangaroo is jumping, the foot hits the ground, you stretch these tendons in the back of the leg, store energy in them, and then as they take off for the next jump, that energy is part of the energy that's going to power the next jump. So it takes a kangaroo quite a bit of energy to get going. But once it's going, a lot of the energy from one jump is basically stored by stretching those tendons and used to start the next jump. So a lot of the energy transfers from one jump to the next jump. And so once they're moving, they don't need to use that much energy to keep moving.